whatever each one of us owns as treasure, cash or property, or acquires or conquers, be it jewels, minted or unminted silver or gold, precious stones or pearls, in whatever form or denomination, this shall be our joint property, without consideration of origin. The eldest among us is to hold these possessions at all times in trust for each one of us, to keep and safeguard them.
With these words, written in 1364, a family with the surname Habsburg officially anointed a collection of decorative art like the world had never seen and may never see again. The 14th century family agreement would become meaningless in the early 20th century when the Habsburg dynasty ended. But a great part of the collection survived. Today, under the protective gaze of magnificent statues depicting Habsburg rulers of the past, the collection is housed in Vienna. There, the Habsburgs themselves constructed palatial homes for their decorative arts.
Behind me is the Kunsthistorisches Museum, which houses on the lower floor all the treasures issuing from the Kunstkammer collections of the Habsburgs.
Only by walking the halls of the astonishingly beautiful museums can observers begin to appreciate the influence that one family had over an entire continent for 800 years.
The Habsburg collection is really a great treasury. It's called a treasury, after all. And it is really, of the royal treasuries that you find around Europe, one of the most important, if not the most important treasury that survives down to the present day.
The oldest piece in the entire Habsburg collection is this intricately designed oliphant horn, carved from an elephant tusk. In medieval times, such items were widely used for transmitting signals while hunting. The engraving explains that in the year 1199, Count Albrecht III of Habsburg presented the horn to a Swiss abbey. Over 500 years later, the oliphant was returned to the Habsburgs as a gift. Although the Habsburg name can trace its origins to the 10th century, it wasn't until the late 13th that Habsburg counts, dukes, archdukes, kings, and emperors began playing important roles in Europe's political arena.
It was one of the great dynasties in European history. In some ways, the greatest, the one that lasted the longest, ruled over the largest extent of territory and the largest number of people.
By the 16th century, the Habsburg Empire had expanded to include countries throughout Europe. At this time, Emperor Charles V claimed that the sun never set on his empire. But the conquering of territories was not enough to establish the image of royalty. Charles V desired precious objects to enhance his reputation.
Princes of the period acquired objects of art, gold and silver plate, as status symbols in order to prove your importance, your wealth, and your good taste. You commissioned and you acquired substantial pieces of silver plate and gold plate. You exhibited these on your sideboard in your dining rooms in order to prove your status.
Prior to the 16th century, such objects were valued less for their artistic merit than their financial worth.
The gold and silver is intrinsically valuable, and therefore you often find that there is a possibility that in difficult times of economic crisis, wars, that gold and silver is melted down to provide cash for whatever's necessary in the way of armies and so on. This was very common throughout Europe.
One of the few pieces to survive from this period was an exquisite wrought crystal goblet belonging to Emperor Friedrich III.
What makes these vessels so special is that at the time they were made, they were substantially more valuable, being made from rock crystal as compared to having been made from gold. One has to imagine that it took 2, 3, maybe 4 years to cut the large rock crystal vessel after it had been brought from Madagascar into Europe.
The goblet bears at its base Emperor Friedrich's motto, AEIOU, an abbreviation for the claim, "It is Austria's destiny to rule the world." Friedrich believed that the Habsburgs were intended to be God's representatives on earth.
Their role as defenders of the faith comes as they defend Europe from the incursions of the Ottoman Empire, the infidel, the non-Christian other of the time. And that was, for the dynasty's self-image, also for their role in European history, a very important part of their historical function.
In order to fulfill the family's destiny as protectors of the Christian faith, Friedrich sought to expand the Habsburg domain not by war, but by marriage. Friedrich decided that his son Maximilian should wed Mary of Burgundy, the sole heiress to the immense fortunes of the Dukes of Burgundy in France.
Their wealth was absolutely unimaginable when the Duke of Burgundy with his bride daughter arrived in Trier, where the marriage negotiations were to take place. He arrived with 400 cartloads of treasure, including tapestries, precious vestments, gold and silver, enameled objects.
A lot of value was placed on who Maria von Burgundy was to marry, especially because she was the only daughter of the family. Maximilian I took this chance and viewed it as a diplomatic opportunity.
Young Maximilian was so impressed by the splendor of the Burgundian possessions, he became what many consider to be the first great Habsburg patron of the arts. This painting of Maximilian was done by the world-renowned artist Albrecht Dürer. Maximilian elevated Dürer from the lower status of craftsman to that of a highly respected master. To show his appreciation, Dürer designed this Maximilian goblet. Realistically shaped golden pears surround the piece, and out of the lid sprouts a twig carrying a pomegranate, the symbol of princely virtues. Although Maximilian had the respect of his court, he nevertheless exhibited the traditional paranoia that seems to accompany positions of such immense power. During this time, rulers of all lands feared the existence of traitors within their midst, traitors who could somehow gain access to the foods eaten by emperors and inject some form of poison. While the rulers all employed tasters to first sample their food, they also placed a folklorish trust in the ability of vipers' tongues or dragons' teeth to detect the presence of poison. In reality, the tongues were fossilized shark's teeth. As legend had it, the teeth would sweat in the presence of poison. Similar antidotal qualities were also ascribed to drinking horns, known as griffin's claws. Actually buffalo horns, the vessels were believed to make poison in drinks visible and harmless. Although Emperor Maximilian treasured his decorative arts, he valued still more the lands of his kingdom.
Now, of course, the problem with Maximilian and his time was that he, too, in spite of the riches into which he married, was constantly in need of money, primarily to finance his wars on the French front on one side and on the Italian on the other. These wars swallowed huge amounts of money. So he was obliged to melt down part of the Burgundian inheritance and to pawn many of the pieces.
One of the most cherished items Maximilian had to pawn to finance his conquests was this sword with a handle made from narwhal or whale tusk. At the time, the material was thought to be the horn of a unicorn. 150 years would pass before the descendants of Maximilian could reclaim the heirloom. Of all the treasures that entered the Habsburg collections through the marriage of Maximilian to Mary of Burgundy, one of the most precious is also the smallest. This delicate lover's brooch, barely the size of a silver dollar, happens to be curator Distelberger's favorite Habsburg treasure.
Dieses Email figural gelegt hat, das Email en rond bosse.
In this piece, we see an incredibly precise and tender painting in enamel, which has been combined with 3 precious stones, ruby, diamond, and pearl. Only very few pieces of jewelry, especially of this quality, have been preserved from this time.
Like his father before him, Emperor Maximilian's primary concern was the expansion of his domain. Also, like his father, he would plan his children's marriages with that purpose in mind. As a consequence, the Habsburg Empire would continue to grow, and so would its collection of invaluable treasures. While Emperor Maximilian I would bring the interests of collecting to the Habsburgs, his daughter Margaret would be known as the first great Habsburg art lover. Unfortunately, she had to endure a tumultuous personal life as a means to that end.
First, she was passed on to the French as a 3-year-old little girl as part of a political agreement. This marriage did actually not come off. Margaret was sent packing back to Brussels, and Maximilian married her off to the heir to the Spanish throne, Juan. Margaret arrived in Spain, aged I think 16 or something like that, and Juan was 18. They fell passionately in love with each other and spent much of their time making love. So much so that people began being extremely worried for the health of young Juan, who became thinner and paler as the days went on, and within 6 months he was dead.
While members of the Spanish court mourned Juan's death, Margaret suffered yet another ill-fated marriage to the Duke of Savoy, who died while hunting. Margaret was appointed by her father as governess of the Netherlands. There, she established her own court and became a strong patroness of the arts. In the mid-16th century, 2 particular objects from the Habsburg collection were officially declared inalienable family heirlooms, never to be bartered, pawned, or sold.
One was a horn of a unicorn, considered at least to be the horn of the unicorn, an unbelievably precious object, full of mythological and religious connotations. That is in fact today, very simply, the horn of the narwhal. The other one was a gigantic agate bowl. This is a bowl that was considered to be the Holy Grail, namely the vessel in which the blood of Christ was gathered up at the foot of the cross. The truth about the bowl is that it is Roman imperial, dating from somewhere probably the 3rd, 4th century AD, and therefore not compatible with the history that is attributed to it.
The first Habsburg to become a legend in his own time for the variety and completeness of his decorative art collection was Archduke Ferdinand II of Tyrol, located in a beautiful alpine valley near Innsbruck. In many ways, Ferdinand was the first Habsburg family rebel,
he married morganatically. Morganatically means he married without considering the rank of his spouse. Due to this marriage, he was basically taken out of the succession to the throne and his wife and children as well. He was in fact obliged to keep his marriage a secret.
Ferdinand II and his wife made their home in Schloss Ambras, a dilapidated medieval castle. Under Ferdinand's direction, the structure was reconstructed to a level of royal splendor. Though his marriage left Ferdinand powerless, his father endowed him with a substantial income. Ferdinand spent much of it on some of the most imaginative treasures ever created. One of the most stunning is the ostrich cup.
Dieses Straußenei ist
The goldsmith made the size of the egg to be the theme of this piece. Since the Middle Ages, ostrich eggs have been symbols of fertility, power, and vitality. It is very difficult to hold this thing or to lift it up to drink from it. It has never been a usable goblet for lack of a spot to grab it.
Practicality was evidently not a high priority for Ferdinand's commissioned items. Many works were created purely as conversation pieces. This jug, made from a triton shell, is a perfect example. Here, a bearded sea dweller carries the shell on his back, mounted with narrow ribbons and a beautifully curved handle. This piece is actually part of a washstand set, though art historians can hardly imagine the object ever having been used in such a manner. The commissioned works of Ferdinand II truly reflected his personality, often his rebellious, mischievous side.
Many of the objects that Ferdinand owned or had made also illustrate his love of fun and whimsy, if you like. There's a pottery figure of a glutton who is seated on a barrel and surrounded by delicious meats and drinks, which he's unable to touch because all these repose on a sort of collar that surrounds his neck.
But Ferdinand also had a refined side, which is evident in exquisite carvings of rock crystal. From the masterful Saracchi workshop of Milan, Ferdinand commissioned this heron, adorned with gold, enamel, precious stones, and pearls. All the natural animal characteristics of a heron are concentrated on the upper part of the object. The lower receptacle section is more abstractly designed, with finely carved scenes and ornamentation. At the time of Ferdinand, actual black and white heron feathers were placed on the heron's head. For centuries, the object went featherless, until they were replaced in 1997. Of all the decorative arts accumulated during the time of Ferdinand II, none is more remarkable than this rock crystal beaker, adorned with gold, diamonds, rubies, and pearls. This vessel, one of the finest works of art surviving from the opulent Burgundian court, formed part of the French royal treasury until the year 1570, when it was presented to Ferdinand II. Another gift to Ferdinand from the French was this so-called saliera. An uneducated observer might view this magnificent work of gold sculpture as a fine museum piece. Today, that assessment would be correct. But in the 16th century, it was designed to hold salt and pepper.
It has a female figure as the Earth and a male figure as Neptune or Triton, representing the sea. And it has on one side a little ship which contains the salt, which was still a rare and expensive condiment, and a little Ionic triumphal arch on the other side which contained pepper.
For artists and art lovers alike, the castle Schloss Ambras remained a safe refuge until 1580, when Ferdinand II's wife died at the age of 53. Ferdinand remained a widower for 2 years, but then re-wed, this time within his own class. Ferdinand himself would die in 1595 at the age of 65. His collection of decorative arts would provide him with an immortality that few traditional Habsburg rulers could equal. But it would be another Habsburg, Emperor Rudolf II, who would gain notoriety as the greatest collector of all. In the history of amassing treasure, there may be no figure more enigmatic and fascinating than Emperor Rudolf II. Crowned in 1576, Rudolf was fortunate to assume power at a time of peace. Prior to the reign of Rudolf II, the Austrian capital of Vienna had been the preferred headquarters of Habsburg emperors. But Rudolf chose to make his home in Prague.
He did not wish to be close to his other family, his siblings, who really disliked him and who antagonized him. He himself was somewhat of a freethinker.
Rudolf transformed Prague into what many perceived as a second Paris, complete with cathedral, castle, and university. Following the basic philosophy of 16th century humanism, Rudolf II considered it morally imperative that he study science, nature, and art. Accordingly, he chose to divide his Kunstkammer, or private museum collection, into 3 specific sections: Scientifica, objects of scientific value; Naturalia, items of natural origin; and Artefacta, materials that became works of art only after being altered by man. The collection of Rudolf II continues to astonish art historians throughout the world today.
The collection of Rudolf II is a very important ingredient in the imperial treasury because he commissioned so much at his workshops in Prague around the date 1600. And you'll find some of the greatest objects in the treasury were commissioned by him and were made in the workshop set up by him with craftsmen and artists brought from all over Europe.
In the area of Scientifica, one of Rudolf's most prized possessions was a clockwork-driven celestial globe, a device which demonstrated the movements of the stars while also telling the time. Incredibly advanced for its era, the technique employed in the globe would later be used in the manufacture of clocks and scientific instruments. Rudolf II was fascinated by the workings of the object. But trouble began when he learned that artist Georg Roll had made another, just like it, for Rudolf's younger brother, Archduke Ernst. Rudolf paid more for his globe, and when it broke, Rudolf had the artist imprisoned. Rudolf II also commissioned this planetary clock from expert clockmaker Jost Bergi, who later would be the first to manufacture clocks with second hands. Built in 1604, the clock represented the indecisiveness at the time regarding planetary movement. The lower clock dial represented the geocentric system, with planets revolving around the Earth. But the upper dial demonstrated the Copernican system, showing the sun in the central position. Noted by many to be a child at heart, Rudolf II truly did love his toys, particularly those that were termed automata.
Automata are objects of fun, basically, for the amusement of people at that time. One famous automaton is called the automaton of Diana, which consists of a figure of a centaur with a lady seated on his back. And this has a clockwork movement inside it. It would move on the table. And where it stopped, the centaur holds a bow and arrow. An arrow would be released, and at whom the arrow pointed or whom the arrow touched, again was obliged to drink a large quantity of wine. Many of these clockwork figures, automata, played music. There's the automaton of Bacchus, for instance, which is exceedingly complicated, has an organ inside it. The automaton moves on the table again, and several of the arms and heads are articulated so that they actually make movements. There are automata like the famous ship automaton of Rudolf II that again has music in it, rolls on the table, and fires off cannons as it moves, and so on and so on.
For those guests of Rudolf II who had little interest in scientifica, the emperor's collection of naturalia was truly astonishing. Take, for example, the unique ewer made of half a Seychelles nut. Created in 1602 under the guidance of goldsmith Anton Schweinberger, the piece also features subtle bas-reliefs etched into the nut by carvers and sculptors. Comparable to what we today call a coconut, the specimen at the time was regarded as a fruit of the sea, accounting for the preponderance of marine world themes, including the figure of Neptune riding a seahorse. The teamwork required to create such an object was only possible because Emperor Rudolf retained a complete staff of court artisans and craftsmen.
The work of the ivory carver, the sculptor, and the goldsmith, as well as inspiration provided by Rudolf's collection, are all combined in one piece. This was only possible at a court at which the artists met and knew of each other's work and the contents of the Kunstkammer.
The only people who had easy access to Rudolf were his own artists, who lived in apartments contiguous to Rudolf's apartments. He saw them every day of his life, he communed with them, and he basically lived with them.
The delicate mounting of naturalia so loved by Rudolf is exhibited here again in a bezoar goblet, created for the emperor by court goldsmith Jan Vermeyen. Bezoars are stones found in the stomach of an Asiatic goat or the South American llama. The term is derived from the Persian word badsar, meaning antidote to poison. Rudolf II, who lived in fear of being poisoned, had this bezoar hollowed out and made into a precious goblet. As the stone itself cost 10 times more than gold, the imperial status of the owner demanded the highest artistic excellence. The ornamentation in gold enamel is considered one of goldsmith Vermeyen's finest works.
It was a good time to be an artist if you were at the court of such an enlightened ruler as Rudolf II. This was not the case everywhere, and artists flocked to the court of Rudolf because of the preferential treatment, the excellent salaries, and the understanding that they had from this extraordinary lover of the arts that was Rudolf II.
He gave them more or less free artistic license. I think he did so partly because he knew, in a way, Rudolf knew that he was bringing these people to a fairly isolated court. But he allowed them artistic license because really amongst the people and the craftsmen and the artists that he had there, they were some of the greatest.
Rudolf's fear of poisoning was reflected in this goblet with cover, made from rhinoceros horns. The expressive character of the piece represents the underlying idea of warding off the demonic powers in nature. The formidable tusks, actually those of an African warthog, give the appearance of being the horns on the head of the wild beast dominating the lid. The small casts of insects on the lid and base symbolize the negative forces in the cosmos. The sides of the goblet are adorned with images of snakes, lizards, and more insects. Healing powers were attributed to the horns and the sculpted branches of coral around the stem and body of the goblet. The mythological powers of Naturalia were again demonstrated in this tankard, made from the tusk of a narwhal. As in earlier Habsburg creations, the tusk of the narwhal was taken to be the single horn of the unicorn. According to Rudolf II's personal physician, the unicorn was prized because it was unsurpassed in the recognition, prevention, and cure of any poison. This explains the intricate setting of the vessel. The rich gold enamel work, set with precious stones, was again the work of Jan Vermeyen. And where did funding come from for all this artistic extravagance?
The money basically was the income from the various holdings of the family, the product of the silver mines, the product of the stone mines, of copper mines, came all basically went into the pockets of the rulers of the time.
For all the funding being channeled into Rudolf II's collections of Scientifica and Naturalia, it still paled in comparison to what was spent on artefacta, hand-carved works of extraordinary value. The expense would ultimately lead to Rudolf's downfall. For Rudolf II's collection of artefacta, the emperor most often went to one source, the master stonecutters of Milan, Italy, the Miseronis. At Rudolf's request, Ottavio Miseroni came to Prague in 1588 and created works of art like this Praesem cup and cover. After Miseroni carved the rich green jasper to breathtaking thinness, goldsmith Vermeyen mounted the vessel in gold, enamel, and gems. While in Prague, Ottavio Miseroni created the Prague School of Stone Cutting.
He created most of the pieces that Rudolf II had in his Kunstkammer. What makes the Prague School of Stone Cutting unique and sets it apart from the artists in Milan is that Rudolf II sent out his own stone searchers. The patterns of the stone vessels at the court of Rudolf II were unbelievably beautiful.
Ottavio Miseroni would work in Prague until his death in 1624. He would leave behind exquisite pieces, such as this stunning jug carved from a single block of honey-colored jasper. Another member of Rudolf's court workshop, Paulus van Vianen, mounted the vessel in gold. Of all the precious possessions created for Rudolf as part of the Habsburg collection, nothing compares to the actual crown of Rudolf, created by goldsmith Vermeyen in 1602.
The crown of Rudolf II is considered to be the most beautiful crown in the world. It is Jan Vermeyen's masterpiece. The crown is made up of three main pieces: the crown's hoop with the lilies headpiece, the mitre, and the harness, the emperor's actual symbol. Vermeyen made each of the parts unique. On the crown hoop, diamonds are dominant. In the second row, the rubies dominate as part of the lilies. A sapphire tops the crown. In the New, as well as in the Old Testament, the sapphire has been connected to the sky. It says that the gates of paradise are made of sapphire. In this case, it is located above the cross, symbolizing that salvation is gained through the cross. Inside the golden mitre, Rudolf II is shown in the four dignities. In the first plate, he is shown as an emperor, commander-in-chief, victorious over the enemies. The second plate shows Rudolf II being crowned King of Rome in the chapel of Regensburg. The third plate shows him during his coronation rite on the crown hill in Regensburg at his crowning to King of Hungary. He points his sword to the four cardinal points symbolizing his willingness to protect the empire against intruders from any direction. The fourth plate is the coronation rite on the Ratsching in Prague.
While the crowns of previous Habsburg rulers had been broken or melted down, the crown of Rudolf II was cherished and protected. It eventually became the official crown of the Austrian Empire. For Emperor Rudolf II, his collection of invaluable works of art would become both his legacy and his downfall. In 1608, the monarch suffered the indignity of being forced by his family to abdicate. Other Habsburgs felt that Rudolf had long abandoned state affairs for self-immersion in the production of art.
Rudolf spent an unbelievable fortune on these works of art, on the salaries of his artists, on the commissions that he made. So much so that that was actually one of the reasons why his family wished to dispossess him of the title and of his functions, because they thought that he went way, way overboard with what he was doing.
When Rudolf II died in 1612, the growth of the Habsburg collection, for all practical purposes, came to an end.
Nobody was able to equal Rudolf's love for the arts, and nobody had the means with which to buy as Rudolf did, or to commission as Rudolf did. In fact, very shortly after the death of Rudolf, the devastating 30 Years' War broke out, which enveloped all of Northern Europe into 30 years of totally destructive warfare, which didn't allow anyone to think in terms of art at all.
No one could have known it at the time, but the Habsburg dynasty itself would one day also be destined to fall. But not before the son of Ottavio Miseroni would create one final work of decorative art that would once more find collectors gasping in awe. In the early 1640s, at the request of Emperor Ferdinand II, Dionisio Miseroni, the third generation of master family stonecutters, was given the challenge of a lifetime. He was asked to carve a huge uncut emerald that had been part of the Habsburg collections since 1612.
So in 1641, Dionisio Miseroni began carving this, and I think it took him something like 8 years to carve this stone into what is today one of the greatest possessions of the Habsburg treasury, a 2,600 carat lump of emerald made into a semblance of a bottle. Not only was Dionisio Miseroni paid a huge fee for carving this emerald, I think something like 12,000 guilders at that time, a princely fee, but he was also ennobled, made into a count for his unbelievable prowess. This emerald has been considered to be today, or back in the 18th century, as the most valuable piece in the Habsburg collections.
Over the next 2.5 centuries, Habsburg rulers changed their interests from collecting art to designing and building stunning works of architecture. In the 18th and 19th centuries, magnificent structures were erected that would one day house the Habsburg jewels, but not under Habsburg ownership. The 20th century would bring an unexpected end to the Habsburg reign. On June 28, 1914, Habsburg family member Archduke Francis Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was assassinated in Sarajevo. The incident sparked the beginning of the First World War.
When the First World War breaks out in 1914, no one imagines that the Habsburg monarchy will come to an end. But by 1917, with the strains of the war and the growing willingness of Austria's allies to begin to encourage the various nationalities within the empire to think of having their own states. Once these two things combine, the centripetal forces within the empire are simply too great for it to survive.
When the conflict ended 4 years later, the nations of Europe, including Austria herself, sought independence from Habsburg rule. The last Habsburg emperor, Karl I, was forced into exile, and the Habsburg dynasty came to an end.
In 1917, with a stroke of a pen, all the properties of the Habsburgs were taken away. Whether they were private or semi-private, there was no distinction made.
Die Familie musste sich dann entscheiden.
The family was faced with the decision whether to sign the new law or to leave the country. The family was divided on this issue. Some followed Emperor Karl into exile, others signed the new law and stayed in the country. I'd say that the parts of the family who had left the country had it easier. The ones who had stayed were exposed to very difficult situations.
The Habsburg reign has now been over for more than 80 years, but in Vienna, visitors daily flock to see a glimpse of a glorious past through a magnificent collection of objects known as the Habsburg jewels. And what is the estimated worth of the collection today?
Major works of art, of the decorative arts, of the type that the Habsburg collected, have fetched millions, in some cases maybe $10 million for a single piece. There are thousands of such pieces here in the Kunsthistorisches Museum and in the Schatzkammer. Some of them worth well in excess of that. I think I have to leave it to you to compute what the value might be.
For modern observers of the priceless collection, the Habsburg jewels remain a symbol of power and wealth, but they also represent something more, a time when a great part of Europe was united under one family banner. Some modern historians wonder what might have been different if the Habsburg dynasty remained. Could the family have prevented a Second World War? Could a Bosnian conflict have been avoided? As time changes many political climates and regimes, the Habsburg jewels remain quietly the same, reminding us of an era of artistic achievement which may never be equal.
Legend says this patch of the Atlantic swallows up its victims. Now, these two experts go head-to-head to demystify that legend. Their conflicting opinions will pit scientific theory against paranormal activity. Who will solve the mysteries of the Bermuda Triangle?